No, hang on. Is it? Close. It's the 28th of October. And this is Anthropology in the Human Condition, lecture number 10. I'm going to talk to you today about research projects. And in particular, because I don't know why, is it not fair to make you do essays unless and concentrate on how they are planned without showing you that I'm teaching you the same way that I would do research. So I thought I'd show you one of my current research projects as an example to show you that the way in which I talk about making a plan for an essay is also the way I think about planning research and writing. I mean, the same steps in a way, hopefully over longer time and more depth and with some funding, although not always, unfortunately. And also some of the restrictions or some of the possibilities that I have are different to yours when you do an essay. But I think there's still quite a lot to gain from looking at this. So, just think that we are presenting the right thing. Yep. I'm going to talk about the ways in which my research on urban migration, culture and innovation at two ends of a project of urban migration works. Now, at Tonduktan University, the research office called DMASTED requires anyone of associate professor or above to have a research group. So, in a way, the research group is the one who does the research. And I'm looking to include as many students as possible in my research group, mostly master's students, some PhD postdoc level students, and when we get the PhD going, but also can be undergraduates, interested and keen, though they need to be. There's no particular special requirement. It's not like a merit thing. It's enthusiasm that makes it possible to do research, I think. I mean, I never thought that the merit criteria for university was a good one because I think everyone can read, everyone can research. And I think of students, or I think the best way for you to think about yourselves, and I think of students as people who are doing research as well. Right? If you think of yourself on a search, or research, right? Search for knowledge. You need to know a little bit of an area, like you need to know what sociology is, for example, before you start a sociology degree. So you need to know there are things you don't know and you need to search for them. So within that, my work is about urban issues. It always has been. From my first book, Removal Calcutta in India. Removal Calcutta was about the city of India and representations of the city. And I've always been interested in how we see the city. Now, I've been here just 3 years. I'm starting to get to know how much I don't know about Ho Chi Minh City. And, well, you know what's really striking for me that's I'm trying to keep it as a bit different, is that I walk everywhere. I don't have a bike. I'm thinking of getting one, I admit. I do love motorcycles. I rode one all of my life until, yeah. But I want to get like 1100 cc, not this 175. It's just not enough for me. I want some grunt. But I still walk around the city. And I think that makes you see the city differently to most. For starters, it makes you see differences as well in the city. For starters, you can't really walk along the footpath, except maybe in Phu My Hung where it's upmarket design. the footpath is interrupted because life is going on the footpath. Motorcycles are parked in the way, or a coffee stall, or bonnet, or banh mi, or bangkun, or whatever is being sold, or people are, I don't know, fighting chickens or doing something. Houses are spilling out onto the footpath. The road is spilling onto the footpath. You can't just walk around easily in the same way. It's interrupted walking. Actually, there's a really good essay I helped get published recently by Huyen and Hogan in the journal Education, Philosophy and Theory, where they look at, in particular, the special form of housing, how the dominant form of housing in Ho Chi Minh City has been what I think people call the shop house, but they call tube housing, right? And that essay is really good because it also talks about how the street is used, the footpath is used, the motorcycles, and how pavements operate in the city. And they show that, you know, the city has different levels of knowledge. And that's really interesting to me. Another example of this is a book by an anthropologist called Eric Harms, called Luxury and Rubble, which I'll hand out for you to look at. You can look at it and pass it around. Civility and Dispossession in the New Saigon. He did his fieldwork in Fumihun in 2010, so it's quite old, but it just came out 2016. And talking about different levels of knowledge, he examined what people thought about people who lived in Fumihun. I mean, he lived there as well with his wife and children in a high-rise apartment. What they thought about that space and its development, but also on the other side of the Fumi Bridge in Thuthien in District 2, he also sat and interviewed the people who are being displaced, right? Whose houses were removed so that District 2 could be developed. So he was looking at the high end and the lowest end. Those people were not compensated well for their houses, or so he says, and so on. And what he Luxury and Rubble, right, the two words of his title, also kind of indicate the two levels of knowledge about the city that he gets from these two sort of communities. That's really interesting to me, and that's part of my interest. Although I'm a bit frustrated by the book, annoyed by the book even. I don't know whether it's because I'm jealous, because he's written a good book, or because he's at Yale and there's a certain style of anthropology that comes from Yale, or he's just a little bit like too American for me, but anyway. Then I was doing a thing with some other professors, in fact, from 19 different countries, professors that came to visit in Ho Chi Minh City about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, and doing a seminar with them for a Global Humanities Institute project that we got funded for. And I was inviting people I knew from Ho Chi Minh City to talk to the professors from 8 different countries. 19 people, 8 different countries. 7 different countries, maybe, not counting Vietnam. And I got a number of people to come and speak. And on one day, we had just so-called NGOs, non-government organizations, come and speak. And one of them was ENDA Vietnam. ENDA Vietnam is a non-government, but a kind of advisory to government organization that do various projects, one of which is on organizing the unorganized, what's called waste pickers, garbage sorters, right? The people who maybe we don't notice that often in the city, although maybe you do notice them a lot, who are going through garbage and sorting it and taking it away. And there are different levels in that industry, like in any other. There's sponsored or supported by organised waste collection, government approved and with big trucks and employed with contracts and salaries and all of that. And they go around to all the apartment houses and shopping centres and so on and cut away rubbish. And then there are people, which you've seen, I'm sure, pushing along these carts, rubbish collecting carts, boxes on wheels, basically. They're getting registered. You now see along painted on the side of them a registration number and so on, which indicates that they are being organised. But then there are much more informal waste pickers who sort of go through looking for plastic, looking for metal, looking for this, that and the other, right? Vietnam does research on who these people are and where they're from, and while they haven't done any research recently, when they did their research, and they had some funding to do proper research, they found that most of these people are migrants with not very high level of education. Say 80% of the women did not finish even first grade of primary, so no schooling to speak of. Something like 40 or 50% of the men didn't, mostly women who were uneducated or undereducated or educated by street wits rather than school. And but they are organising themselves. A lot of them are migrants from Cambodia or nearby countries rather than anywhere else. And actually migrants from within Vietnam who come into the city. And that really interests me because internal migration is not the sexy, glamorous subject. In migration studies, internal migration is not studied as much as, you know, crossing the sea migration or something like that. But the thing is, there are different levels, even among the people that are going through your garbage. I got really interested in, you know, people going through your garbage because they seem to know a lot, right? Their knowledge, especially their knowledge, is my paranoia, their knowledge about you. You can tell a lot about someone from their garbage, their class status, their habits, even their secrets, right? There's the famous scene in detective novels where you go through the garbage to find out what someone's doing. But they also keep the city alive. And what's interesting there is the formal and the informal levels of waste pickers, of waste collection. It's really essential to keep the city going, to stop rubbish piling up. And they must know that, of course. And they're like a level of the city and knowledge that's very different to the planning, the people that Eric Harms is talking about in that book, the luxury level, or even the government planning, zoning. In another course, I talk a lot about special economic zones and science parks being planned for Ho Chi Minh City, the high-tech sector, you know, hoping that the city will, or the country will develop from special export zone, offering cheap labour to corporations to be able to scale up to do high-tech work and kind of leapfrog the leapfrog model. The frog model is very strong in thinking about the development of the country. But the planners need to think about how the informal sector, the waste collecting sector, both formal and informal, but the informal sector especially is essential for the formal to work. What we call formal labour, the formal sector, employed jobs, salaries, all of that really relies on there being a kind of hinterland of the informal and even the illicit, illegal sector or activities to keep the city going. Without those unplanned or unpredicted or informal aspects, the formal can't work. If you think of how Eric Harms talks about the development of Fumihon, they came, the corporation, a Taiwanese corporation, came and built out of the swamp, that's their narrative, the city, and they built basically some towers and roads and shop houses. But if there hadn't have been the development of a kind of street culture around those shop houses, it would be very sterile. In fact, it still is, I think, compared to other parts of Vietnam. But any other parts of the city, any part of the city that really feels like it's lived in has got a formal apparatus, streets and houses and so on, but also an informal level of activity, and that's what makes it work. So I'm interested in these levels. Of course, I'm interested in the top level as well. A book like this one, a book like this one, let's say, first of all, this is actually set in Hanoi, but Traders in Motion. It's about all the street food sellers and how they're on the move, right? Food on wheels, basically. You can have a look and pass that one around as well. But at the top level, or even actually at all levels, this book is really interesting, from 2013, I think it was, by Alison Truitt, Dreaming of Money in Ho Chi Minh City. And this looks at everything from high-level real estate development plans and big bucks through to just a startup coffee company type thing, beginning with them. So you can look and pass around. So far, this is introducing my research project, but without only staying at the level that's my interest, right? I haven't actually started to plan anything or talk about anything in a way, you could say. I got interested in solid waste management, right? Where does the waste go and so on, and started to collect these things. But as I said, I had to form a research unit, and within the university, the research unit is what does the work. So I'm interested in urban migration, and a lot of the urban migrants to the city, not just Ho Chi Minh, also to cities like Cà Mau and Mai Tho and stuff, migrants from the Delta areas that are moving because the Delta is in trouble in a way, right? So I formed kind of, it's just a thing on paper, right? Until it gets funded, it doesn't really exist. Urban Migration Research Lab. And the idea was, it was with Professor Mai. Her interest is in worker integration. So we're going to focus on who's coming to Ho Chi Minh City and what they will find, how they will get integrated into the fabric of the city. And we'll do similar things in Cà Mau, Can Tho, Mai Tho, places like that. But that's just the idea, right? That's the interest. Right? How are we going to go about doing research about this? Well, why should we do it is the first question. Why do something with this interest? Why look at the Delta and the city together? Because I always think that you should look at, you can't just look at the city without looking at the rural. You can't look at something without its context. So the context is, I keep on seeing, I'm sure you've seen them too, the United Nations or different global bodies keep on stressing that because of climate change, because of food security, because of global challenges, the Delta is an issue. And the Mekong Delta in particular is an issue because of a range of environmental, political and economic factors that are really hot topics. Okay. It's presenting the recent kind of journalistic pieces, I want to say, are using UN data and resources to say the Delta is in trouble because of ecological crisis, because of rising sea levels or various things. And it's going to mean that up to 20 million people will have to move. Right? That one of the maps I saw from you, based on UN projections, was that in 30 years' time, no one will be able to live anywhere around this area. I think that was exaggerated. But there's a big stress on what will happen to the Delta because of, one, rising sea levels, but also other crises. You must know that some of this, right? That, and why it's a bit of a political football as well, it's economic, because a whole series of dams built on the Mekong River further upstream in other countries, in particular China and perhaps even more so Laos, have been reducing water flow of the Mekong into the plains area of southern Vietnam, to the point where like massively less nutrients in soil and possibility of agricultural success that previously has been enjoyed by the Delta very much, has been put at risk. Okay, so you know how this works, I'm sure. I don't need to tell you that much about it. The annual flood season, I know we have floods up north around Da Nang and Hoi An and so on. Terrible and loss of life is bad. But the annual floods in the south, in the Mekong, they're kind of required to make the river work, to make the plain area fertile. Because for I was going to say decades, but for thousands of years, the silt from the Himalayas basically washed down in the river, then hit the flooded landscape of the plain, and the water spread out, the water carried a lot of nutrients with it, and then as the flood waters receded, left the nutrients on the land. Right? So the floods, the annual floods, was like fertilizing the land by bringing silt downriver and so on. I mean, the river does lots of other things as well, fish and water and so on, but it also brought nutrients for the soil. And this made that Delta area one of the incredibly productive areas of the planet. Right? Like for rice, for fruit, for sugar cane, for all sorts of products produced, right? But the dams that have reduced the flow of the river, plus drought, some unprecedented drought, and also the kind of rain, even if there's not drought, the kind of rain that's been coming has changed a little bit, so that there's less gradual rain and more occasional really heavy storms. A really heavy storm is not good for wet rice. It just washes, it beats it away. And wet rice, right, it relies on the slow water level. not a fast-flowing stream, slow water level. If the water comes really fast, it can wash away rice. And the other thing is, if you don't have the floods, like annual flood, I mean, it's down like 50% or something this year on average. Right now, that's the latest statistic from some work of a guy called Mike Tatarsky, who I mentioned in the slide coming up. 50% less water coverage. And so that's 50% of the land is not getting productive. But if the flood water is not there, then that leaves a kind of empty space for seawater to come inland. And this year, apparently, seawater, salt water, salinization, right, which also destroys rice crops. If salt water gets into your wet rice cultivation, that kills off the rice. It's come like about 100 kilometers further than previously. Now, this is disastrous, right? So you've got rising seawater, salinization, drought, lack of river water. That's affecting fisheries. The big lake in Cambodia is drying up and not having its annual flood either. That's killing off the fisheries there, so those fish would swim downriver as well. Also, the affects the dolphins. They were already in trouble, but still. Plus, weather patterns that have brought heavier rains to destroy crops like around Kamau. And even in Kamau, the sea has forced a near collapse of the thing that was built to stop the sea from coming in. What's it called? A water break. I want to say water break, but that's not right. A breakwater, right? Like a mound of dirt that goes for about 100 kilometers. Has been built along the coast because the seawater was coming in, just to stop the seawater. Mangrove trees were planted either side of it because they really have been useful in reducing wave and erosion, but they've been lost as well because of high seas. And this levee this breakwater has been close to collapse. And if that happens, the rice production around Kamau, and a huge part of the delta, is going to be affected by salt water as well. What this means for livelihoods is that then there's a knock-on effect. People can't make an income. Only some of them can turn their land, if they own land, because there's labourers and there's landowners, right? Some are wealthy enough to either sell their land, if they're lucky, or turn their land into some other economy that doesn't rely on the water. For example, and we see this a lot, ecotourism. In fact, going to have a look for myself, wanting to set up this research. I thought I'd better go and have a look. I spent earlier this year, just after lockdown, when the tourist economy was, what was it? Nui Viet du Lic Vietnam, right? A Vietnamese should visit Vietnam. I went to visit as many places as I could around Can Tho and so on. And a lot of the former orchards, fruit orchards that are no longer as productive because of salinization, are turning into eco-lodges or eco-tourism. And that's interesting because that was happening in the last few years. And of course, that's also been hit by another disaster, the collapse in the foreign tourism industry. So even those who could try and get out of agricultural work into ecotourism, and that wasn't many, were also hit by COVID. Now they hope that COVID will not be permanent, so they're trying to hang on. But you know, ecotourism is not the kind of tourism that Vietnamese middle class go in for that much. It's really a thing for Westerners. Not completely, but I certainly didn't see many Vietnamese couple wanting to sit around in a bamboo hut beside a river and do nothing. They want a different kind of holiday experience. Fair enough. Okay, so I was interested. I went and had a bit of a scoping look. I started to read around. So I had to develop some research questions. So the objectives of the research, I started to think about what would be my question. What would be my question that would structure my research? Not my essay, my research. And of course I thought, right, so there's these displaced migrants. What do they need to facilitate integration? And social cohesion. What do they need? Like, okay, the government has been building like new cities outside of Kamau and Kanto that decant displaced people, move people from rural agricultural areas into city areas. But you can't just put people into an apartment block and say, right, you live there now, especially if they're still, a lot of them, they've moved to these high-rise cities, but they're not staying there all the time. They're commuting back and forth to their plots of land in the countryside. So they are like adding to global warming by commuting back and forth in addition. And yeah, you need some more than just a place for people to stay. Right? So what do they need? What will integrate people from the rural areas into city areas? And what will promote social cohesion? I don't have answers for those things yet, but I'm interested to find out what people think they might need. Then the big question of whether or not migration from these areas is a different experience depending on who is migrating. Like in terms of level of displacement, like were you forced to move or did you want to move? That might be require different kinds of support. Class position, how many people were shifted because they lost their employment. For example, one of the former fruit orchards that I stayed and visited had turned into an eco-lodge and had 25 employees. 23 of them had been let go because of COVID. Right, so they were then without job and without income and without any funds. The owner, of course, can try and sell, if anyone wants to buy an eco-lodge, 400 million is the going price, right? Quite a big eco-lodge. It's quite fantastic, actually. I was very tempted. If only I had 400 million. But they are in a very different position, right? Because they have some capital. You can move to the city. All right, you can't buy an apartment for 400 million. You can't even get a room, really. But you're in a much happier position than someone who's lost their job and has no savings. So what are the differences according to class and experience? Then, first of all, we need to know what services are available for migrants and what are the best ways to research that? What are the best ways to map it? And I'm very interested in map making, as you must have picked up somehow. So I was thinking of this as a methodology, potentially. So how will we map what services are of particular interest for migrants to the city? Everything from the work of End of Vietnam, as I mentioned, they are trying to organize the informal waste pickers. through to, I guess, one of the issues that came up around COVID in the city was that a lot of the undocumented street workers couldn't access the government for COVID. When the lockdown happened, they had made their money by moving around the city, right? If you can, instead of sleeping on that book, you could pass it around for others to look at. That was the idea. Keep it in motion. They were in motion, right? But when lockdown came, they had no means of getting an income because they couldn't move around, or they had to do it illegally. And they were not documented, so they couldn't sign up for the government support for having lost your income, or the different programs of income substitution and benefit, right? Which was interesting because then government has used that offer of cash money, support money, to get people onto the books, to document them, which is necessary for track and trace as well. And of course, the people who move around the city for a job, especially working with waste, are probably the most vulnerable to contagion of COVID, both to get infected or to be carriers, even though we didn't really have that much COVID in any of the cities, right? But they're the ones that you want to be tracking and tracing as well. So that was kind of a win-win there. They got some, finally, eventually, the funding got through, I believe. So how do you map those people, and what are the best ways to distribute such services? What are the best ways to market them? How do you let people know there are such services? Because if you're a migrant, undocumented or like informal sector migrant coming into the city, you don't know your way around by definition, right? It's not like you had grown up here. And then what's involved in contextualizing needs provision assessment? And how do we also map or think about the patterns of struggle and success or difficulty, survival strategies for different communities in the city? So like I had my set of questions and I made them, I refined them and changed them, but they were what would go up near the front of my essay, of my research proposal. So the idea and some questions I wanted to answer, what the issue was, right? It's important to say that at the start. Of course, I said a little bit already about the context, but those questions make it more focused and give the reader a pretty good idea of why this is happening. Okay, I could also just say, look, I want to do work with these people. Most people don't notice them, and they're getting organized. What's going on? Then I look around at some of the literature, what's available. And I can see that there's quite a lot of it. And it talks about what I had already mentioned. I kind of already knew that there are rising sea levels and salinity, but they're not the only issues. There are problems with some of the resettlement programs. There's cities that are being built for migrants. People are not feeling integrated. There's drought, inundation, coastal erosion, and what's happening with industrialization, changes in those processes, and how people have confronted them over time. These are all discussed in the literature. I give a couple of examples. Nin, 2007, Hoi and Koi, which I really love. 2011, right? So you can read some background stuff, and that's what you kind of have to do for your issue. Find out what the state of the art is. What is the current thinking around your particular issue? And you read your way into that. All right, you search, put your keywords into Google Scholar and find the key things. And they can tell you about what's going on. But really on the Mekong, the current set of scholarly discussions, especially in cultural and social science research, there's a few. They didn't struck me, I didn't feel like they were telling the whole story or even going very deeply. Quite often they weren't systematic. And that was also true of the End of Vietnam group, right, that I mentioned, the NGO. They had done research, like proper research, sociological research on waste pickers in 2011 or something, but nothing since, because they didn't have funds. So it's kind of old data, and everything subsequently was anecdotal. You know what I mean about anecdotal in a research paper? It's like what I told you about the floods, that water areas of around Khao Mau or somewhere were 50% down on the annual floods, and that meant that the siltation process wasn't returning nutrients to the soil in the way it usually does. I read one anecdote in Tartaski's, not in this Mekong Review article of 2020, but in a shorter piece that he did for his Patreon newsletter. It just came out yesterday, actually, or today, no, this morning, where he has interviewed someone who's standing on a road that's completely dry and says, if we'd have done this last year, we would have been 1 metre deep in water, because that's how much the floods have not come this year. This area is not underwater, it's completely dry. But that's like an anecdote. That doesn't tell you anything sound, anything. It's like good backup material, but it's not scientific. Is that the word I'm looking for? It's not substantial. And Tartaski is good at talking about this. He says exactly, it's only anecdotal evidence about migrant lives after migration that we see in popular magazines, and that's what he writes for, and not substantial research. It's good to know, helpful from him, and someone like him should really be deployed, and I'd like to work with him on this project. At the same time, there are more substantial cultural research with a longer frame of reference, but that's based more on much bigger cultural questions, like what's happened to Cham identity, like it's over hundreds of years. You know? Or religious and minority groups, Indigenous groups, Taylor, 2014, Biggs. So I'm reading around in the background areas. Right? I'm getting a bit of an idea of what is there, but also what's not there. That's important, to know what's not there and look for that and see maybe I can find a way to fill that kind of gap. Something more than anecdote is needed, and more on what happens to migrants after they migrate. But also that somehow there needs to be more stuff on culture, cultural questions and issues around the story of how government interventions putting people into new settlements, resettlement programs are working. Resettlement isn't just a matter of putting somewhere somewhere else. There needs to be a theorization, thinking and research and discussion of integration. How can we get that? So I see that as a gap. I'm kind of excited about that for the research project because there's a reason to do it, and there's a kind of thing I want to do. I can see a need to fill that gap, but how can I do it? One way of thinking about how to do it is to look elsewhere for comparative examples that will either show how to do it or show what not to do, or be completely different. It just so happens that I previously worked in a Delta area and written about Delta, not a huge amount, but for 30 years I've been visiting Calcutta as a researcher, did my original PhD work there, and Calcutta is a city just a little bit older than Ho Chi Minh City by about officially 10 years or something, maybe 12 years. And it's in a delta area. Let me show you where it is. So you know that India is like this. India is not like that, but here is Sri Lanka, right? And Bangladesh is here, Malaysia, and somewhere over there is Vietnam. The Himalayas are here, and the Ganges runs down here and then splits into this huge delta. There's also the Irrawaddy there. The Mekong actually goes from the other side of the Himalayas and ends up going through China, Cambodia, and Laos into Vietnam, right? It's from the north side of the Himalayas. Eventually, I mean, you wouldn't like set a stick floating up near the Himalayas and think that it would flow all the way down to Kamau, but technically, possibly, yeah. But the Ganges, the Ganga, ends up in, this is the delta here, the Mekong Delta, and there's maybe two major tributaries in there. This is called the Sundarbans. Sundarbans Delta, and it's halfway between Bangladesh and West Bengal state of India. So it's split between two countries. It's a borderland. Now, the split for the Mekong Delta, most of the Mekong Delta is in Vietnam, but the kind of lungs of the fisheries is in Cambodia. And I suppose part of the delta is in Cambodia, but mostly this area of Vietnam has been formed over thousands of years by silt that's flowed down the river, and when the floodwaters meet the sea, spread out and dried out and deposited on the land. And that's why it's really flat in that area, but that's why it's also really rich. Because basically it's all the good soil that's come down off the mountains and deposited at the end. It's washed down this river. And by the time it gets to the flatlands, it's going quite slowly. When it floods, the water is not rushing. So rice can grow. As the water gets higher, rice grows more, right? And it doesn't get washed away. In the north, well, there is a delta, the Red River Delta, and so on, but in that area, to grow rice, you need to build ways to retain water. The rivers are too fast, and the water is hard, right? So north and south rice is different. We've got different names for it. I don't need to tell you these things. This is part of the context, right? But the Sundarbans, as an example, they're also very verdant, have mangrove forests and so on, and rich in the land is rich with nutrients, so it really grows well. It's another like rice basket or rice bucket or whatever you call it of the world, except that the government policy has been unlike the Mekong Delta, which was clear the land, build agricultural, farming and industry for people. The Delta in India has been in favour of, I'm afraid you can't see it, the tiger. It's been anti-people, or less for people. There are people that live there, but the World Wildlife Fund was able to convince the Indian government that it needed to protect the tiger. And in Vietnam, that didn't happen as much. because people needed livelihoods, right? Needed to support people, right? The Indian government didn't support people. Well, what kind of people? This area was an area of migration by refugees from Bengal. In fact, in 1974, a large number of them who had moved to an island in the Sundarbans called Anthrpology or something like that, were forcibly removed at gunpoint by the government with a number of deaths, like 100 or something deaths. A story that was suppressed for a long time, but really a terrible story. Now, that was to protect a certain amount of the land from any kind of development so that the tigers would have space, right? Tiger land was better than human land. Of course, tigers also eat humans, and when tigers get pushed into a smaller and smaller area, they have less other things to eat, so it became harder for people to live with tigers, although there was a relationship, if you like, with villagers and living with tigers. They knew how to handle it. There are other animals, of course, in the sanctuaries, crocodiles and so on, that also take people. But the question of animals, that's one that comes up when you start to think of comparative things. What's happened to animals in the Mekong Delta? Of course, there are buffalo and there's pigs and chickens and ducks and geese and so on. But the relationship with animals and people is close here and productive, driven by farming, whereas here it's driven by the idea of wildlife, which is really a push for tourism and for international aid money from the World Wildlife Fund. Another difference, the Ganga River does not have something that the Mekong has a lot of, which are dams. Some 11 in China, and maybe even more, different tributaries as well, in Laos. In fact, the dams in Laos now stop more water from going downstream than the dams in China. But if you listen to the United Nations, you won't hear that. The United Nations likes to beat up China. Of course, so does Vietnam, I know. But it's Laos that's stopping most water right now from flowing down river. These dams, the Chinese dams, are a bit old. Dams don't last. I mean, they're not a wise investment for development. You build a dam, right? If you build a dam in a forest area, you've got to build the dam and all the vegetation gets covered with water, right? Now, the first 5 years, that vegetation has to rot, and it produces an almighty stink, right? So the whole area becomes very toxic. All right, that settles down. All your people have been displaced because their villages are underwater now. Then the dam starts to function. But the dam, of course, lasts for a certain amount of time, maybe 30, 35, 40 years at most, because a dam, and here's the river, we're filling down, going downstream, bringing silt downstream, put the dam up, the water comes up to the top of the dam, but the silt is still coming down, and the silt starts to deposit at the bottom of the dam. And over a period of 30 years, the dam becomes very shallow. And either the dam has to get bigger or you have to build another one to keep that production, that hydro or whatever production going. Dams don't have a long life compared to their investment. Right? So there's big debates to be had about their value. And you notice that people aren't damming so much at this end of the river, only up here because, you know, sure, they want some of the water to come out. Be better off to put pumps, frankly, in the water, take out some of the water rather than stop the silt. The silt is the nutrient that's going downstream. They're just building up the silt inside the dam, and that's of no good to anyone. Anyway, yes, one of the reasons why there's one of the differences between India and the Mekong, between the Ganga and the Mekong rivers, is the absence of dams, because India has the whole of the river, right? Whereas this river is split between 1, 2, 3, 4 countries: Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, China. That's all, isn't it? Yeah, 4 countries, and we're very happy to criticize China. For some reason, Laos is not so much discussed, but they also, yeah, anyway, I'm not particularly getting into that, but that's brought up, that issue is brought up by looking at the comparison, the 2 different rivers. And of course, then you should think about other rivers. What about the Amazon? Of course you think, well, green parts of the world, verdant, productive areas, the Amazon forest, the greenest thing there is. And of course that's being destroyed by logging and the indigenous people and so on. Okay. All right, I'll stop here for a bit and we'll continue. I'll just pause and we have a break. And I've got about 15 more minutes, I think. And then I want to spend some time working on essays. Or mapping. Yeah, no, sometime I'm mapping, then essays. All right, thank you. So it's a part-time break, half break.